There's a type of tiredness that has no name in the medical dictionary. It doesn't show up in blood tests. It has no clear diagnosis. It's not the fatigue of working too much, or of someone who doesn't sleep well, or of someone going through an illness. It's the tiredness of having been with someone, specifically with someone you get home after spending time with that person, and you need to sit down, or lie down, or simply stay in silence for a long while before you can go back to being yourself. As if the interaction had consumed something you don't know exactly what it is, but whose absence you feel. And the most confusing part is that sometimes the conversation was normal. There was no fight. There was no dramatic moment. Nothing you can point to and say, that's what exhausted me. And yet you're exhausted. That has a name. Not in the medical dictionary. In the shared experience of millions of people who have been close to someone, the Stoics would have called the one who extracts without returning. Today we're going to talk about the 5 signals that identify that type of person in your life. Not with rage, not with the goal of building a case against them, with the analytical coldness Epictetus taught. Observation without drama, data over experience, the clarity that allows deciding. Welcome to episode 2 of Relationships That Destroy You. This is Stoicism for winners. If the first episode opened the possibility that something is wrong, this episode puts a name to one of the most specific ways that something can operate. The emotional vampire is not a movie villain. They don't have fangs. They don't arrive at night. They don't do anything a defense attorney couldn't easily justify. They do something much more subtle and therefore harder to detect. They leave you empty without you being able to point to the exact moment the emptying occurred. Seneca observed something he wrote in his letters that has been exactly right for 20 centuries. That there are people after whose company you leave poorer than you arrived. Not in money. In what the Stoics called vita, that vital element you carry with yourself, and that is nourished in genuine interactions and depleted in constant extractions. The question is not whether that person exists in your life. The question is whether you already know who it is. Before the 5 signals, there's something I want to tell you about the word vampire. I don't use it to vilify. I use it because it's precise in what it functionally describes. A vampire, in the sense that matters here, is not someone evil. It's someone who cannot sustain themselves with their own resources and therefore needs to extract those of others. They don't choose it in the sense that one morning they woke up and decided to drain the people around them. They do it because it's the only way of functioning they know. That doesn't make it your responsibility, but it does make it a diagnosis worth making. Marcus Aurelius was a man who governed the most powerful world of his era and who had around him every type of person. Those who came to give, those who came to take, those who did both. And he wrote about the importance of seeing each type clearly, without rage toward any of them, but without confusing one with another. Seeing clearly is the first act of governance over one's own life, and the 5 signals that follow are designed for that, to help you see. But before we begin with the common signals, I want you to do something simple. Think of the person who first came to mind when you heard the word exhaustion at the beginning of this episode. It doesn't have to be the most obvious person. Sometimes the first name that arrives isn't the one you expected. If that name is there, if there's someone specific your mind brought before you could decide to bring them, go to the comments and write only this: I already know who it is, not the name, not the story. Just those words. because writing them in a space where someone else can read them is the first out-loud acknowledgement of something you've perhaps known in silence for a long time. And because there's someone else reading those comments tonight who needs to know they're not alone in that recognition. Go, write it, and when you come back, we continue. First signal: the conversation always ends up revolving around them. There's a way to know that doesn't require sophisticated analysis, only memory. Think about the last time you had something to share, something that mattered to you, a problem that weighed on you, an achievement that made you happy, news you needed to share. And think about how the conversation that followed went. How long was your topic at the center before something shifted? Was your story the springboard to theirs? Was your problem the reminder of a problem of theirs that turned out to be bigger, or more urgent, or more complex? Was your achievement the occasion to enumerate their own? There's a difference, Seneca described, with a precision I haven't found better articulated anywhere else. The difference between listening and waiting for your turn to speak. Listening is an active act. It requires putting your own inner world on pause to give space to the inner world of the other. It's an act of real generosity because it costs something. It costs the attention you could be dedicating to your own thoughts, your own concerns, your own needs to be heard. Waiting for your turn to speak looks like listening from the outside. There's eye contact. There are nods. There's the physical gesture of listening. But inside, what's happening is very different. The person is processing which part of what you're saying gives them an opening to talk about what they want to talk about. The emotional vampire doesn't listen in Seneca's sense. They wait. And they wait with skill. They know exactly when to intervene, so the shift seems natural. Marcus Aurelius had a principle he applied as a ruler and also applied in his personal relationships. He said we should judge by actions, not by words. That character isn't declared, but demonstrated in patterns of behavior over time. Someone can tell you they care, can tell you they're there for you, can make sincere statements about the importance you have in their life, and at the same time, in the concrete practice of every conversation, systematically place their needs above yours. Words say one thing. The pattern says another. When there's contradiction between the two, the pattern is the truth. Epictetus taught what he called observation without coloring, seeing what's in front of you without adding the layer of interpretation you'd prefer to be true, without the filter of love that wants the person to be different from what they demonstrate being, without the filter of habit that has normalized the pattern until it became invisible. Just the data. How many of the last 10 conversations ended up being about you, not the ideal percentage, the real one? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is information. There's something about this first signal I want to name because it's what makes it hardest to see. The emotional vampire frequently has a gift for making their needs seem urgent. Their problems are always more serious. Their crises are always more acute. Their pain always has an intensity that makes yours seem lesser by comparison. Not necessarily because they lie about what they feel. They may genuinely feel that urgency. But there are people whose inner world is so noisy it makes it impossible to hear any other world beside it. And the practical result for you is the same regardless of whether the urgency is real or constructed. Your things have no space. Your inner world becomes the backdrop to their stage. And if you've been in that dynamic long enough, you may come to believe that's how things work. That your problems aren't that important. That your inner world doesn't deserve as much space. That you're the type of person who gives more than they receive in conversations. That's not who you are. It's what the dynamic taught you to believe. And there's a difference that deserves to be recognized. Seneca said that the soul, with no voice of its own, eventually loses the ability to find what to say. That the constant silence of someone who always yields their turn produces a form of atrophy in self-expression. If you've gone a long time without feeling, your conversations have space for what you really want to say. That too is information about what this relationship has cost you. The first signal is not a character flaw of the other that you should judge. It's a pattern you should see clearly, without the filter of what you'd like to be true. And, once seen, with the same analytical coldness Epictetus taught, the question of what to do with that information is already yours to answer. There's something more about the first signal that completes the picture. It's not only that the emotional vampire hijacks conversations toward themselves. It's what happens when you try to redirect them. There are people who, when you notice the conversation shifted toward them and you gently seek to return to the original topic, allow it. They notice. Sometimes they even name it. "Hey, I drifted. Were you telling me something?" And they come back with genuine attention. And there are people who, when you try to redirect the conversation, something changes in the environment. A subtle tension, a discomfort not expressed in words, but felt. As if your attempt to have space in the conversation were an act of selfishness that requires being tolerated. That contrast, that difference in the response to the same action, says more about someone's character than any statement of intentions. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the examination of patterns. He didn't judge anyone by a single action. He looked for consistency. The direction repeated behaviors drew over time. An isolated incident reveals little. The consistent response to a consistent situation reveals everything. If every time you seek space in the conversation, there's that tension. If every time your inner world appears, something in the other becomes uncomfortable. If the relationship only flows without friction when you are the audience and the other the protagonist, that's the pattern. And the pattern, observed without the distortion of affection that wants it to be different, says what it says. Epictetus would have asked here a question that sounds simple and is devastating in its precision. Have you felt seen in this relationship in the last 6 months? Not listened to superficially. Seen. That specific feeling that the person you're with knows who you are, what matters to you, what weighs on you, what makes you happy, and that it genuinely matters to them. Have you felt it? If the answer requires a lot of thought, that too is information. And that information, held alongside the pattern of conversations, is what completes the picture of the first signal. Not the accusation. The diagnosis, which is always the first one that needs to be made before any response can be chosen. There's something about the first signal I want to develop, because it touches something rarely named with this: precision. The moment you realize you've gone a long time without sharing the important things with that person, not because you decided not to, but because at some point, without there having been a conscious decision, you stopped trying. The process is gradual. The first time you shared something important and the conversation drifted elsewhere, you perhaps told yourself that day wasn't the right moment. The second time, you thought maybe it wasn't the type of thing that person knew how to accompany. The third time, you simply kept what you had to share. And over time, without anyone asking you to, you learned to filter what you shared. You save the things that matter for other people, or for yourself, or for silence. With that person, conversations become light by default, not because you chose superficiality, because the attempt at depth repeatedly went nowhere and your system learned it's not worth the attempt. That too is information about what the relationship is costing, not in terms of what happens in the relationship, in terms of what you no longer bring to it. Epictetus and his observation without drama would have pointed this out with a simple question. How much of your real life, of what genuinely happens to you and matters to you, do you share with that person? Not in theory, in the practice of recent months. If the answer is less and less, that direction has a name: progressive closing. And progressive closing in a relationship that should be one of closeness is not neutrality. It's the adaptive response of someone who learned that opening in that direction produces a consistently unsatisfying result. It's your system protecting you, and when your own system starts protecting you from someone who is supposed to give you something worth receiving, there's something in that signal that deserves more attention than anything else you could do this week. Marcus Aurelius asked himself questions about his relationships that were uncomfortable precisely because they were honest. One of them was this: with this person, can I think out loud? Not talk, think out loud. That specific state, where what comes out of your mouth is still taking shape, where you don't completely know what you think until you say it, where the other is the safe space where your own clarity can emerge. Can you do that with that person? Or is there an editing process that happens before you speak? A filter that evaluates what's safe to say and what's better kept? If there's a filter, there's something in the relationship that installed it, and that something deserves to be named. Seneca wrote that relationships where you can't think out loud are not company. They're an audience. And an audience, however numerous, cannot give you what only the real presence of someone who genuinely listens can give. That presence, that space, that possibility of being seen while you're still forming what you are. If in your life that presence is absent in the relationship where you most expected it, that absence has consequences that go beyond the discomfort of a particular conversation. It has consequences on which parts of yourself have space to exist and which are left without voice. That's what the first signal, seen in its complete depth, reveals. Not only that conversations revolve around them, that your conversations are no longer the space where you also have a voice, and recovering that voice, even if you don't yet know how, is already the right horizon. I'm going to stay a moment longer on something the first signal doesn't completely say yet. The specific loneliness of being with someone who doesn't listen to you. There's a difference between being alone and feeling alone. The loneliness of being physically without company is uncomfortable, but has its logic. You know where it comes from. You know what produced it. And generally, you can do something about it. The loneliness of being with someone who doesn't listen to you is different in an important sense. It doesn't have the clarity of the first. You're in company. There's a person in front of you, or on the other end of the phone, or in the same room. All the external conditions of connection are present, and yet there's a void the physical presence doesn't fill, because what's missing isn't presence. It's reception. Seneca described it in a way I keep finding the most exact available. He wrote that one can go to many places and have gone to none. That company can be numerous and the solitude deeper than in the desert. Spending time with the emotional vampire produces exactly that paradoxical loneliness. You were there. You gave your attention, your energy, your presence. There was verbal exchange. There were the formal elements of connection. And you end up more alone than before it started. Not because something bad happened, because nothing that truly mattered was received. That loneliness, that specific type of emptiness left by company that isn't real company, is one of the most disorienting experiences that exists in the territory of human relationships. And it's disorienting precisely because its cause isn't obvious. You can't point to a concrete moment where someone did something concrete. The loneliness appeared out of nowhere, or at least that's how it seems from inside. But from outside, with the diagnosis the first signal offers, the cause is fairly clear. You were with someone who can't listen because their inner world doesn't have the necessary space for yours, not from malice, from limitation. But the result for you is the same. You returned alone from where you went seeking company, and that accumulated loneliness, from all the times you sought something in that relationship that wasn't available, has consequences that go beyond the discomfort of a specific day. It has consequences on what you expect from relationships in general, on how willing you are to open up, on how quickly you close when the other starts talking about themselves, on the protective mechanisms you develop without anyone teaching them to you. Recovering the ability to genuinely seek and genuinely receive what a relationship can give starts by recognizing when what you're looking for isn't where you're looking, and that, recognizing where it isn't, is sometimes the first step toward finding where it is. That's what the first signal, in its totality, has to offer you. Not just the diagnosis of what's missing in that relationship, clarity about what you're looking for. And that clarity, held with honesty about what each relationship in your life can offer, is the foundation from which the most important decisions are better made. Before moving to the second signal, there's something about the concept of emotional vampire that deserves a clarification that completely changes how you work with this information. The term does not imply the person is aware of what they do. In most cases, they're not. The emotional vampire doesn't wake up in the morning with a plan. They don't have an elaborate extraction agenda. They don't calculate how much energy they can take from you before you're depleted. They simply operate from the only way of relating they know, a way that, at some point in their history, was the only one available. That they learned in environments where genuine reciprocity didn't exist or was scarce. That they internalized as the normal way relationships work, and from that way of relating, they seek what we all seek: connection, recognition, the feeling of mattering to someone. Only they seek it in ways that extract instead of create. That doesn't make it your responsibility to heal, but it does change something in how you can see what's happening. You're not the target of calculated cruelty. You're in the field of influence of someone who doesn't have the tools to relate in a way that gives you instead of taking from you. And from that understanding, the territory of possible decisions expands considerably, because it's no longer about escaping an enemy. It's about honestly evaluating what type of relationship, if any, is possible with someone who can't listen to you the way you need to be listened to. That evaluation, done without the heat of resentment or the blindness of love that wants everything to be fine, is the one that produces the most intelligent decisions. And the first signal, by putting into focus what's missing in conversations with that person, is the beginning of that evaluation. There's something about this first signal that connects with something broader about the nature of Stoicism applied to relationships. Stoicism is not a philosophy of toughness. It's a philosophy of clarity. Epictetus didn't teach not feeling. He taught not being governed by what you feel. The difference between the two is the space where all the freedom Stoicism promises lives. When you apply that distinction to the first signal, what emerges isn't heartless analytical coldness. It's something more complex and more human. You can feel the pain of not being genuinely listened to. You can feel the disappointment that someone who matters can't give you what you were looking for. You can feel the sadness of recognizing that a relationship you value has a real limitation that can't be ignored. All of that is legitimate. All of that deserves space. The clarity this episode proposes doesn't go against those emotions. It goes against letting those emotions produce denial of what's happening, feeling the pain of the pattern, and at the same time seeing the pattern clearly. That's Stoicism in relationships. Not the kind that doesn't hurt. The kind that hurts and still sees. And from that seeing, can choose how to respond to the pain instead of simply being dragged by it. That's the freedom the first signal, once recognized, begins to open. Not the freedom of it no longer hurting, the freedom of the pain not being the only factor that determines what you do next. There's something final about the first signal I want to leave before moving to the next ones. The loneliness it produces is not only the loneliness of not being heard in conversations, it's also the loneliness of not being able to talk about this episode with the person who most needs to hear it. There's something deeply ironic in emotional extraction dynamics. The person you have the problem with is exactly the person it's hardest to talk to about the problem, because that person doesn't have the capacity to listen in the way the conversation requires. Because trying would probably produce exactly the pattern of the first signal. The conversation would drift toward the other's needs, toward their perspective of the facts, toward how this affects them. And that impossibility of having the conversation you need with the person you need it with has an effect that goes beyond immediate frustration. It leaves you with something that has to go somewhere else. Sometimes it goes to a friend, sometimes to a professional, sometimes to silence, sometimes to a Stoicism podcast on a Tuesday night. And that place it goes to is not an inferior substitute for the conversation that should have been possible in the relationship. It's the evidence that the system seeks. Health. That something in you knows what you're living needs to be processed, named, seen by someone. And that if that processing can't happen inside the relationship, it happens outside it, because the need doesn't disappear for not having the right channel. You're here listening to this for a reason, and that reason, even if you don't have it completely articulated yet, is also information. Among the most important of tonight, there's something more about the concept of emotional vampire that deserves to be said with honesty before continuing with the other signals. The term can produce a clearer image than reality usually is. In reality, people are not completely emotional vampires, nor completely nourishing. There are people who, in certain contexts, in certain periods of their life, or with certain specific people, operate with the patterns this episode describes. And, in other contexts, in other periods, or with other people, they may be capable of genuine reciprocity. That complicates the diagnosis, because if the person in your life has had moments where they did listen to you, where they did respect your space, where they were present when you needed them without needing anything in return, those moments are real. And their reality doesn't cancel the dominant pattern. but it does make the diagnosis more complex than a podcast episode can completely capture. What this episode can offer are the 5 signals as instruments of observation. What it can't do is know the specific details of your situation, of your history with that person, of the factors that complicate the evaluation. Only you know that. And that's why the conclusion of what this means in your specific life is yours to make. Not this episode's, not any external voices that doesn't know the nuances you do know. What the 5 signals do is sharpen your ability to see. What you see with that sharpened ability is yours to interpret. Marcus Aurelius was very clear about something that's pertinent here. That wisdom doesn't consist of applying general principles without considering specific circumstances. It consists of understanding the principles well enough to be able to apply them with judgment to each concrete situation. The 5 signals are general principles. Your concrete situation has its nuances, and the judgment that unites the two is yours. That's not a limitation of this episode. It's the nature of how applied wisdom works. Second signal, your boundaries are treated as negotiable suggestions. I want to talk to you about a very specific moment. The moment you say no, not the dramatic no, not the no of the important fight, not the no that's been preparing for weeks, the everyday no, the it's hard for me right now, the I need space, the that topic makes me uncomfortable, the small, reasonable no that anyone who cared about you would receive without much trouble. What happens when you say that no to that person? Because there are 2 types of possible response to a boundary set, with clarity and without aggression. The first is from someone who respects it. There may be disappointment, there may be moments where it's hard for them, but ultimately they accept. The boundary is recognized as the boundary. The no is received as no. The second is from someone who negotiates. And when I say negotiates, I don't mean an honest conversation where both seek a solution that works for both. I mean something different and more corrosive. Someone who turns your no into the beginning of a process whose only objective is getting your no to become yes. Sometimes with direct pressure, sometimes with arguments that sound reasonable but are fundamentally ways of questioning your right to have set the boundary you set. Sometimes with silence, with that specific silence that isn't the silence of respect, but of punishment. The silence that tells you that you did something wrong by saying no. Marcus Aurelius wrote about serene firmness as one of the most difficult virtues to cultivate. Difficult because it requires holding your own position without hardening your heart toward whoever tries to move it, without rage, without crusade. Only the quiet certainty of someone who knows where they end and the other begins. There's something in that description that's especially relevant here. The quiet certainty. Because what the emotional vampire does with boundaries isn't just try to cross them. It's installing in you the doubt about whether you had the right to set them. Suddenly you're justifying why you need that space, explaining what's wrong with them, calling you at that hour, rationalizing why that topic makes you uncomfortable, as if discomfort needed an external reason to be valid. And in that justification process, something happens that Epictetus would have identified immediately. You've reversed the burden of proof. The boundary should exist because you set it. Period. It needs no more justification than your own need to set it. But suddenly you're arguing like a defendant before a jury, explaining why you deserve the boundary you set, as if setting boundaries were a privilege earned and not a right held. Seneca had a phrase about this that hits every time I see it. He said that the free man is the one who doesn't need anyone's permission to exist within the limits of his own life. That sounds philosophical in the abstract. In the concrete, it means this: you don't need to explain to anyone why you don't want to receive that call at that hour. You don't need to justify why you need time for yourself. You don't need to build an argument to defend that you're not available always for everything. If there's someone in your life for whom you do need to do all of that, someone for whom your boundaries always need to be justified and can always be questioned and are never simply accepted, that person isn't seeing you as someone with their own rights. They're seeing you as someone with resistances to overcome. And the difference between the two is the difference between a relationship and an extraction dynamic. There's something about boundaries and emotional vampires I want to name, because it's the most confusing part of all. Sometimes the emotional vampire genuinely doesn't understand they're crossing a boundary. They don't do it with calculated malice. They do it from an internal map where other people's boundaries simply don't carry the weight their own do. From a way of seeing the world where their needs have an urgency that makes everyone else's seem secondary. That doesn't make it less harmful, but it does make it harder to confront, because when someone violates your boundary from genuine ignorance, the most obvious response of pointing it out can seem like an overreaction. The other seems surprised, perhaps even hurt that you take it that way, and you end up feeling like the problem for having expected your boundary to be respected. That's exactly the trap. Marcus Aurelius was very clear about something especially useful here. Intention doesn't change. Effect. You can cause harm without wanting to. You can violate someone's freedom without any malicious intention. The absence of malice doesn't cancel the real impact of the behavior. If someone, with or without intention, systematically makes your boundaries go unrespected, the effect on your inner freedom is the same. You feel less free in your own life than you should feel, and that effect is enough to deserve being named and addressed, regardless of the other's intention. The second signal, seen in its totality, isn't about judging someone as bad. It's about recognizing a pattern that costs you your freedom. And inner freedom, as the Stoics repeated from different angles with philosophical stubbornness, is the only good no one can take from you unless you allow it. When you start noticing it lost, you already have enough information to ask yourself what you're allowing. Third signal, they only show up when they need something from you. I want you to do a memory exercise. It's not complicated. It only requires honesty. Think about the last 5 times that person reached out to you. Not the times you sought them out, the times they sought you. What was the context of each contact? They needed advice about something, needed to vent about something, needed help with something concrete, were in crisis about something, had a problem to solve. Now think about the last 5 times you needed something. Were they available, with the same urgency with which they seek you when they need? Or were there excuses, postponements, an availability that never quite arrived? Seneca wrote about true friendship in terms that, 20 centuries later, remain the clearest standard available. He said, "The true friend is the one who is present with the same consistency in abundance as in scarcity, when they can give something and when they can only receive, when you're well and when you're not." And he said something more that stays with you, that the one who only shows up when they need something is not your friend. They're your client. The emotional vampire has developed something that from the outside can resemble intimacy, but at its core is the opposite. They've learned to call you at exactly the moment their need is at its peak, with the emotional intensity that need produces, with the urgency of someone who genuinely suffers. And in that moment, when they arrive like that, when the pain or the crisis or the need is evident, it's very hard not to respond, because responding to someone who suffers is a legitimate and valuable human impulse. The problem isn't that you respond. The problem is what happens when the cycle repeats enough times. When you see the pattern of when they show up and when they don't. When you notice that in the periods where everything is going well for them and they don't need anything, you don't exist for them. When you recognize that the intensity of the connection you feel in moments of crisis is inversely proportional to their presence in your life when the crisis passes. Epictetus would say something here that sounds harsh and is true. That confusing being needed with being loved is one of the most costly mistakes a human being can make. Being needed feels like love. It has many of the same sensory characteristics. The intensity, the closeness, the feeling of mattering to someone. But it's not. Love chooses. Need doesn't choose. It takes what's available. And if the person in your life seeks you urgently when need is high and disappears when there is none, what you've been is not chosen. You've been used, not with malice. Not with awareness, necessarily, but used. Marcus Aurelius spoke of reciprocity, not as emotional accounting, but as a sign of health. It's not about keeping exact scores. It's about the direction of the flow having a reasonable logic over time. If the flow always goes in one direction, that direction is out of you and into them. That's not a passing imbalance. It's the structure of the relationship. And the structure of a relationship reveals its nature more than any specific moment of connection you can remember. There's something about the third signal that deserves to be named with special care because it touches something painful. Sometimes we are someone's last resort. Not because we're the best friends, not because we're the most important people in their life, but because we're the only ones who still answer. The emotional vampire, over time, depletes relationships. The intensity of their needs, the one-sided flow, the absence when they don't need anything, produces in the people around them exactly what it produces in you: exhaustion. And the people who've been in their life longer, who have more distance or more experience with the pattern, already set the boundary you still haven't been able to set. They stopped being available in the same way. And you, who perhaps arrive fresher to the relationship, or who have a capacity for giving that hasn't yet reached its limit, or who can't bear the idea of not responding when someone needs you, you're the last one who answers the phone. And they tell you, as if it were an honor, "You're the only one who understands me. You're the only person I can talk to." Seneca would have decoded that phrase without mercy. You're not the only one who understands them. You're the only one who hasn't yet learned to protect themselves from what that way of relating costs you. Being someone's last resort is not a distinction. It's a signal that everyone else already arrived where you're still on your way. That too is information. And tonight, alongside the other signals, it deserves its space. There's something about signals 2 and 3 together that illuminates something neither can illuminate alone. The second speaks of what happens when you set boundaries. The third speaks of when that person shows up. Together, they draw the map of the relationship with much more precision than each one separately. If they only appear when they need something from you, And additionally, the boundaries you set when that happens are systematically ignored or negotiated. What you have is a structure where the person has unlimited access to you when it suits them, and you have limited access to them when it suits you. That's a power asymmetry disguised as a relationship. And power asymmetry, when it installs itself in a relationship that should be between equals, produces exactly the effect this episode is describing: the gradual emptying of whoever is always on the giving side. Marcus Aurelius had an image for healthy relationships that serves as a useful contrast. He described them as an exchange of real value, not in economic terms, but in terms of what people bring to the relationship and what they extract from it. A healthy relationship has a balance that can fluctuate over time, but that generally moves toward the enrichment of both. A relationship with an emotional vampire has a constant flow, always in the same direction, always out of you. And that constant flow, observed with the analytical coldness Epictetus taught, without the noise of love or habit that makes it invisible, is the structure these two signals together reveal. Not so you decide anything tonight, so you see what's in front of you. With the clarity, Seneca considered the condition of every good decision, because you can't decide well about what you don't see correctly. And now you see a little more. That's enough for this signal. The next two go even deeper, toward where the body speaks more clearly than the mind, and toward where the trap closes in the most subtle and hardest to escape way. There's something about the second signal, boundaries, that I want to develop, because it's where most people get trapped without being able to get out. The trap of flexibility. There's a narrative about relationships that says rigidity is the enemy of connection. That people who cling to their boundaries without flexibility are closing themselves to love, to depth, to the possibility that the other genuinely needs them. That narrative has some truth in the right context. In a healthy relationship, yes, there is flexibility. There are moments where you yield some of your space because the other genuinely needs it, and because yielding in that moment is an act of love that makes sense within a pattern of reciprocity. But the flexibility the narrative describes presupposes something the relationship with the emotional vampire doesn't have: reciprocity. When flexibility is reciprocal, when both people yield sometimes and both have their boundaries respected sometimes, flexibility is a virtue. It builds intimacy. It demonstrates that the relationship matters more than the rigidity of any position. When flexibility only goes in one direction, when you're always the one who yields and never the one who receives the other's concession, flexibility is not a virtue. It's the narrative the emotional vampire uses to convince you that every time you yield you're being generous, and every time you set a boundary you're being rigid. Epictetus would dismantle that narrative with a direct question: who pays the cost of that flexibility? If it's always you, you're not being flexible. You're being exploited with the vocabulary of generosity. There's something more about boundaries that deserves to be said. The way the emotional vampire makes setting them feel like an act of cruelty. When you set a boundary with someone who genuinely suffers, who has real needs, who comes to you with an emotional intensity that's hard to ignore, there's a moment of discomfort that feels like abandonment. You're not abandoning anyone. You're establishing the border between their world and yours, which is exactly what the Stoics considered necessary, not out of selfishness, but out of integrity. Marcus Aurelius wrote about compassion without fusion, that we can genuinely feel for the other's suffering without dissolving into it, that helping from strength produces different results than helping from the fear of the other's suffering if you don't help. If your boundaries disappear because you can't bear the pain they seem to produce in the fear other, you're not setting them from freedom, you're setting them from fear and then retreating at the first sign the fear is justified. And that cycle of setting and yielding, of trying and giving up, of establishing and abandoning, is exhausting in a very specific way, because every time you yield, something inside you knows you yielded, and that accumulated knowing produces a form of self-distrust that over time can be more costly than any other consequence of the dynamic. The trust in your own ability to establish and sustain what you need to be well. Recovering that trust starts with recognizing the pattern of when you yield and why. And that recognition, even if it changes nothing tonight in external circumstances, already changes something in the relationship you have with yourself. About the third signal, they only show up when they need something. There's one more dimension that completes the picture. What happens inside you during the periods when the emotional vampire disappears because they don't need anything? There are people who, in those periods of absence, feel relief. A relief that comes accompanied by guilt, because there shouldn't be relief when someone who supposedly matters to you is absent. But the relief is there anyway. That mix of relief and guilt is itself one of the most precise signals that exist. The relief tells you that something about that person's presence was a burden that has been temporarily lifted. The guilt tells you that you have an idea of how you should feel that doesn't match what you feel. And the mix of the two tells you that you've been inhabiting the contradiction between what the relationship should be and what it actually is for a long time. Seneca would have recognized in that contradiction exactly the type of inner tension that produces gradual deterioration of well-being. The tension of living in the discrepancy between what you see and what you want to see, between what you feel and what you believe you should feel. You don't have to resolve that contradiction tonight. Only recognize it as the information it is, and let that information occupy the space it deserves in the composition. Complete picture of what this relationship produces in you. I'm going to develop something about the third signal that touches territory rarely named directly. What happens in you when you start seeing the pattern of when that person appears and when they don't? There's a moment when the pattern becomes undeniable, when you can no longer not see it, when the correlation between their appearances and their needs is so consistent that resisting it would require an amount of energy you no longer have to spend on denial. And in that moment, alongside the recognition, something unexpected usually appears. Shame. Not the shame of having done something wrong. The more difficult shame. The shame of having let yourself. The feeling that you should have seen it earlier. That it should have been obvious. That you took too long to see something that, in retrospect, seems so clear. Epictetus would have disarmed that shame with precision without cruelty. You didn't take long because you're naive. You took long because what? The emotional vampire offers in moments of need, that intensity, that apparent connection, that feeling of being indispensable to someone, activates something in you that is genuinely valuable. The capacity to give, the desire to help, the impulse to be there when someone needs you. There's nothing wrong with those capacities. The problem isn't in them. The problem is that those capacities were leveraged by someone who doesn't offer reciprocity, and recognizing that doesn't require punishing yourself for having the capacities. It requires being more selective about with whom you use them. That's the distinction that matters, not that you stop being someone who gives, that you learn to recognize who can receive what you give and return something of real value, and who simply takes. Marcus Aurelius articulated it in terms that are useful here. He said generosity is a virtue when exercised from choice and from capacity, when the person giving has enough to give without emptying themselves, and when the person receiving can use what they receive for something that goes beyond filling a bottomless well. Generosity towards someone who can't receive in a way that produces something real is not virtue, it's a misapplied resource. And recognizing that doesn't make you less generous, it makes you wiser about where to apply what you have. That's what the third signal, in its most complete version, offers you. Not the conclusion that you must close off. The clarity about what type of exchange is possible in this relationship, and from that clarity, the possibility of choosing better. About the second signal and boundaries, there's something final I want to add about the specific cost of living without them. When boundaries are systematically not respected, and when the person learns to yield before the pressure arrives to avoid the discomfort of the process, something happens that goes beyond the specific dynamic of that relationship. The person loses practice in holding their ground, in placing themselves at the center of their own decisions, in knowing what they want and acting from that without needing anyone external to validate it, in existing within their own borders with the peace of someone who knows they have the right to be there. That practice of holding your ground is, for the Stoics, the foundation of inner freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want without consequences. The freedom to know who you are and act from that even when the exterior pushes in another direction. When a relationship systematically erodes that capacity to hold your ground, it doesn't just take energy in individual encounters. It takes something deeper, the familiarity with your own center, and recovering that familiarity, that knowledge of who you are when you're not yielding, when you're not filtering, when you're not adjusting to the other's expectations. That is one of the most important pieces of work any person can do. It starts with recognizing when you lost it, and when it started being lost. That honesty, though uncomfortable, is the first step of its recovery. There's something about signals 2 and 3 I want to develop from a perspective rarely included in these conversations. The specific cost to the one who gives, not the general. Emotional cost, which we've already explored. The more concrete and more measurable cost, the time that doesn't go toward what matters. Every hour you spend managing violated boundaries, negotiating what shouldn't need negotiation, recovering from the exhaustion of having given what nobody asked you to give, but the dynamic extracted anyway. That hour doesn't go to your work, doesn't go to the people in your life who can give you something of value in return, doesn't go to the projects that matter, doesn't go to the rest your nervous system needs. It goes to managing a dynamic that shouldn't require that much management. Marcus Aurelius was very clear about time as the most valuable resource we have. Not money, not energy, time. Because time can't be recovered, can't be created, can't be stored for when you need it more. It's the most limited and most equally distributed resource that exists. And when you observe how much of your life goes toward managing a single relationship that doesn't return proportional value, the evaluation changes. It's no longer just a question of how it makes you feel. It's a question of what you're choosing not to do with the resources you dedicate to that dynamic. Seneca wrote about time with a notable urgency. He said, "Time is the only thing we can't borrow, that we can't recover when lost, that passes regardless of whether we use it well or poorly." Evaluated from that perspective, the cost of the emotional vampire isn't just the exhaustion of encounters, it's the opportunity cost of all the other possible uses of that time and energy. That doesn't mean every relationship should have a calculable return on investment. Human relationships are not commercial transactions and shouldn't be. It means that when a relationship consistently takes without giving, the imbalance isn't just emotional, it's an imbalance in the distribution of the most limited resources we have. And recognizing that isn't pettiness, it's Seneca's wisdom about time applied to the petty. Evaluation of relationships. About the second signal and boundaries. There's something that connects with Stoic thought about freedom in a way worth developing. The Stoics distinguished between outer freedom and inner freedom. Outer freedom is the ability to do what you want without external obstacles. It's valuable, but vulnerable. Circumstances can reduce it. People can limit it. Events in the world can destroy it. Inner freedom is the ability to choose your response to what happens. To not be governed by impulses, fears, the demands of the exterior. It's the only freedom no circumstance can completely take away. When the emotional vampire systematically violates your boundaries, they don't just violate your outer freedom in the sense that they do what you said you didn't want them to do. They violate your inner freedom in a more subtle and deeper way. They make you doubt your right to have those boundaries. And when you doubt your right to have something, that doubt operates from within. It doesn't need an external agent to produce its effect. You carry the interference with you. And that's exactly what the Stoics would call the most dangerous slavery. The kind that doesn't need external chains, because it operates from the interior. Recognizing that mechanism, seeing how the repeated violation of boundaries eventually produces doubt about whether you had the right to set them, is the first step to deactivating it. Not all at once, gradually, but it starts with recognizing it for what it is, not your insecurity, the result of a pattern that was installed from outside and that you learned to host inside. That distinction completely changes whose responsibility it is to undo it. You don't have to cure your insecurity. You have to recognize the source of the pattern and decide what you do with that recognition. That's something completely within your reach. There's something about signals 2 and 3 together that connects with something the first episode of this series established, and that's worth bringing back here. The first episode spoke of silent damage, of how the deepest deterioration doesn't happen in the big events but in the accumulation of the small ones. Signals 2 and 3 are exactly that applied to 2 specific dimensions. The second signal documents the accumulation of crossed boundaries. Each one on its own seems minor. A call that came when you said you couldn't. A topic that returned after you said it made you uncomfortable. A presence when you asked for space. Small events, none of which would justify a serious conversation on its own. But, accumulated, drawn over time, they reveal a pattern that is not small at all. The third signal documents the accumulation of selective appearances. Each contact when they need something, separately, seems natural. People reach out when they're in difficulties. That's normal. But when the consistency of when they appear correlates too perfectly with their needs and too little with yours, The sum of those individual contacts reveals something none of them reveals individually. The Stoics, and Marcus Aurelius in particular, had a way of seeing that could be called vision over time. They didn't judge anything by a single moment. They looked for the direction the moments drew together. Because the direction is the truth, the moment can be misleading. When you apply that vision over time to these two signals, the picture that emerges is clearer than any evaluation of an isolated encounter. The direction of your boundaries is consistently toward yielding. The direction of their appearances is consistently toward your resources. Those two directions together, seen over time, are the most honest map of the relationship available. Not the version of the good moments, not the version of the exceptions. The real direction, verified by the accumulated pattern. And that map, though it may be painful to see with this clarity, is exactly what makes it possible to make informed decisions, which is what this episode is about. Not giving you the decisions, giving you the instruments to see them with greater precision. There's something about the profile of the emotional vampire that's important for understanding why these signals are so hard to detect from inside. The emotional vampire frequently has a particular gift, the gift of making their needs seem more urgent than yours, not necessarily through obvious dramatization. Sometimes, simply because their inner world is genuinely louder, more intense, more urgent than yours seems by comparison. And you, who are perhaps someone with greater tolerance for your own discomfort, who has learned to manage difficulties more internally, who doesn't produce with the same visible intensity the signals of your own needs. You seem like the one who can wait, while their needs are so evident, so urgent, so present. That asymmetry in the expression of discomfort is not an asymmetry in the depth of the discomfort. It's only a difference in how it's communicated. But in practice, it produces exactly the result. The second and third signals describe your needs always wait because theirs are always more urgent. Your boundaries always yield because their need for access always seems more pressing. Recognizing that, seeing the asymmetry not as evidence that your needs are lesser, but as the consequence of a difference in expression, is part of recovering the correct perspective on what's happening. Your needs are not lesser, they're just less noisy. And that's not sufficient reason for them to always be the ones that wait. Fourth signal. After seeing them, you need to recover as if from an illness. This signal is the most physical of the five, and therefore the hardest to ignore when it presents, though paradoxically also the easiest to misinterpret. There are people with whom after spending time you end up charged, not necessarily euphoric, not necessarily having the best day of your life, but with something you didn't have before. More energy, more clarity, more desire to do the things that matter to you, as if the interaction had added something instead of taking it. And there are people with whom you end up exactly the opposite, with less than you arrived with, a tiredness that doesn't correspond to the time or the activity, a kind of mental fog you didn't have before. The specific desire to be in silence, to not interact with anyone else, to need a recovery period before being able to return to your normal life. Seneca observed this phenomenon with a precision that's remarkable, given he didn't have the scientific vocabulary we use today to describe it. He wrote that there are people whose company is like a cloudy day that doesn't end, that you can spend hours with them in conversations that from outside might seem normal, even pleasant, and end up with a feeling of heaviness you can't easily shake off. And he added something I continue to consider one of the most precise observations about relationships that exists in Stoic thought. That heaviness doesn't need to be explained to be real. You don't need to be able to point to the exact moment where it happened. You don't need to identify the specific phrase or the concrete gesture or the particular event that produced the emptying. The emptying happened. Your body registers it. That's enough. Marcus Aurelius spoke of the body as instrument of the soul and as its most honest witness. He said the body has no emotional agenda. It isn't trying to preserve any narrative about the relationship. It doesn't care whether admitting what it registers is uncomfortable or whether it has consequences you don't want to face. It simply reports. And when the consistent report is tiredness, headache, tension in the neck and shoulders, that diffuse discomfort that starts in the chest, that interrupted sleep the night after the encounter, that report deserves to be taken seriously, not as hypochondria, as information. Epictetus taught the importance of knowing oneself in detail, not abstractly, but with the specificity of the scientific observer who takes note of what occurs in their own system under different conditions. What happens in your body before knowing you're going to see that person? Is there something that contracts? Something that anticipates with tension rather than openness? What happens in your body during? Are there moments where something tenses without an obvious reason? An alert that activates though the conversation seems normal? And what happens after? Those three questions, answered honestly over time, produce a diagnosis no intellectual analysis can produce in the same way, because the body knows before the mind, and the body doesn't lie to make the situation more comfortable to live in. There's something about the fourth signal I want to develop because it's what makes it hardest to recognize. The confusion about the source of the exhaustion. The emotional vampire frequently has moments of genuine connection. There's laughter. There are conversations that, in the moment, feel meaningful. There are gestures of affection that seem real because on some level they are. And then, when the tiredness arrives after, there's a dissonance. We tell ourselves, but there were good moments. But I laughed. But there was something that felt like intimacy. How can it have exhausted me if I also enjoyed parts of it? Seneca had an answer for that dissonance that is devastatingly simple. The price of something isn't determined by its best moments. It's determined by the total cost of having it. If the energetic bill of the relationship, measured not in the peaks of connection but in the average state over time, is consistently negative, the good moments don't cancel the cost. They disguise it. And the disguise makes the cost harder to see, but doesn't reduce it. The tiredness you feel after isn't ingratitude toward the good moments. It's the cost of the extraction that occurred in the rest of the time. Marcus Aurelius used a practice he called seeing things without their ornaments, seeing wine as fermented grapes, the purple mantle as wool dyed with shellfish blood. Not to destroy the pleasure of things, but to see their real nature, without the layers of narrative that make them seem more or less than what they are. Applied to this context, the practice would be this: see the relationship not by its best moments that you keep in memory as evidence that it works. See the relationship by its average effect on you. How are you when this person is an active part of your life? Not in the peaks, in the average. That answer is what the fourth signal asks for. And if the answer is a level of energy, clarity, and well-being consistently lower than what you have when that person isn't present to the same degree, The fourth signal is already identified. Fifth signal. You feel like nothing you do is enough to satisfy them. This is the cruelest of the five, because it operates on something the Stoics considered the foundation of all virtue: the ability to act well and to know you acted well, regardless of what the outside world says about it. The emotional vampire undermines exactly that. Not directly, not with explicit criticism necessarily, but through something more subtle and more corrosive. Permanent dissatisfaction, the standard that's always a little higher than where you arrived. The feeling that no matter how much you give, how much you try, how much you adjust and improve and adapt, there's always a gap between what you offer and what's expected, and that gap doesn't close, no matter how much you give. The gap remains. Seneca wrote something about the bottomless well that's particularly exact here. He said, "There are desires that can be satisfied, and there are desires that can't be satisfied because they don't arise from a real need, but from an interior state that no amount of external satisfaction can resolve." The emotional vampire lives in that second type, the need for approval, for attention, for always being at the center of someone's concerns, is not a need that's satisfied when attended to. It's a need that grows when attended to, because the mechanism that produces it isn't the lack of attention, but something much deeper that no amount of external attention can remedy. And you, who are trying to fill that bottomless well, are not failing. You're trying to solve a problem that has no solution from where you are. Marcus Aurelius had a principle about external recognition that's relevant here, though from a different angle than it's generally applied. He spoke of not needing the world's applause to know you did the right thing, of finding in your own certainty of having acted well the satisfaction that doesn't depend on others' approval. But he also recognized, in the honesty of his meditations, that in close relationships we do want to be seen, we do want our effort to be recognized, we do want the person we love to see what we give them and value it. That's not weakness. It's humanity. The problem arises when that reasonable expectation of being seen and appreciated is applied to someone who structurally can't fulfill it, because the emotional vampire can't give you what you're looking for, not because you're insufficient, but because what they need is for you to never be sufficient. Epictetus would have said it with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. If someone needs you to fail in order to keep needing you, they will never declare your success. If the function you serve in someone's life is that of chasing a standard you never reach, the distance between where you are and where the standard is the control mechanism that keeps you moving toward it. That's not a love relationship. It's a management dynamic. And recognizing it, though it hurts, though it completely changes the way you see something you perhaps named differently until now, is exactly the type of clarity Seneca identified as the first step of freedom. There's something about the fifth signal I want to name, because it's the part that confuses most. The way the emotional vampire makes you feel, special in the moments where they seem to draw close. There are moments, in relationships with this type of person, where something changes, where it seems they finally see you, that they finally appreciate what you give, that there's genuine recognition of your value and your effort. Those moments are powerful, and they're what make you stay, because they confirm what part of you wants to believe. That the standard can be reached, that if you keep trying, if you improve in what's missing, if you give a little more in the right direction, there will be more of those moments. But observe what happens after those moments. Does something different install itself in the dynamic? Does the standard lower? Does the gap between what you give and what's expected reduce in a lasting way? Or does the moment pass and you return to exactly the same place you were? The permanent emotional debt. The feeling that something is missing. The insufficiency that never closes. If the answer is that you return to the same place, those moments are not signs that the relationship can work differently. They're the coins the system tosses, so you keep playing. And that recognition, though the most difficult of the five, also deserves its space tonight. There's something about the fourth and fifth signals together that completes the picture in the most complete way available. The fourth speaks of the body, of the physical exhaustion the interaction produces, of the energetic bill charged to the nervous system that the body registers with an honesty the mind sometimes can't match. The fifth speaks of the soul, of that specific erosion of confidence in one's own value that living in permanent emotional debt produces, of what happens to the image you have of yourself when no effort turns out to be enough. Together they say something important for completing the diagnosis. The emotional vampire doesn't damage you on a single level. They damage you on every level they have access to. The body, self-esteem, time, energy, the ability to see your own reality clearly, the network of relationships you had before, the versions of yourself the relationship gradually left without space. It's not isolated damage, it's systemic damage. And systemic damage, precisely because it affects all systems simultaneously, is the hardest to detect from inside. Because when you're at the center of it, everything seems like the normal state of things. That's what the five signals together do. Break that normalization, not to produce alarm or to dictate conclusions, to return to you the ability to see what's in front of you, with the eyes Epictetus taught, those of the observer who neither adds nor takes away, who sees data as data and patterns as patterns. And from that vision, the question of what to do is already yours, completely yours, as it always was, even when the dynamic tried to convince you otherwise. There's something about the fourth signal I want to expand because it touches a dimension rarely named in this context, the anticipation effect, not just the tiredness after. What happens before? There are people who, upon knowing they're going to interact with the emotional vampire, already start feeling something before the interaction occurs. A kind of defensive preparation of the nervous system. That state of prior alert the body activates when it knows something costly is coming. Sometimes it's so subtle it barely registers consciously. Just a slight tension that appears when that person's name appears on the phone, a small contraction when you know you'll have to see them soon, an automatic adjustment of the inner state before entering the space where they'll be. Epictetus would have pointed to that as the most revealing signal of all. Because the nervous system doesn't anticipate interactions, it expects with genuine openness that way. It anticipates that way the ones it has learned, through repeated experience, have a cost it needs to prepare to pay. That anticipation isn't anxiety without cause, it's the body's memory doing its job. And the question Marcus Aurelius would have asked himself before that state of anticipation is the same I propose to you now. If your body already knows what it's going to cost before it happens, what does your body know that you're still processing consciously? About the fifth signal, the bottomless well, there's something that needs to be said with special clarity. The difference between love that challenges you to grow and the dynamic that keeps you in a state of permanent insufficiency. Because it's a difference that can be hard to see from inside. Genuine love also sometimes produces the feeling of wanting to improve, of wanting to be more for the person you love, of feeling there's a better version of yourself that person deserves and toward which you want to move. That's real and valuable when it comes from the right place. The right place is this: the person who loves you sees you as enough right now and at the same time inspires you to grow. Not because you're insufficient, but because their love makes you want to be more than you already are. The wrong place is the emotional vampires, where the feeling of insufficiency doesn't come from inspiration, but from the systematic deprivation of recognition, where it's not that you want to grow toward something better, but that you're running toward a standard that always moves. The difference between the two inner states is absolute, even though from outside they may seem similar. In the first, you feel seen and want to give more from that being seen. In the second, you don't feel seen and give more in the attempt to be seen. The first nourishes. The second depletes. Seneca would have articulated it in terms of what drives the effort. If what moves you to give is abundance, genuine love that wants to give more, that's sustainable. If what moves you to give is the fear that what you've already given isn't enough, that takes you in a direction no effort can resolve, because the problem isn't in the quantity of what you give, it's in the structure of what you receive in return. And that structure, that inability of the emotional vampire to receive with genuine satisfaction, is not something you can change with more effort. You can only see it, and, from that vision, decide what you do with what you see. That's what the 5 signals together offer you tonight. Not the decision, the vision. And vision, as the Stoics always knew, is where everything begins. There's something about the 5th signal that deserves additional development on how it operates over time. The permanent emotional debt doesn't install itself all at once. It builds in layers, exactly like the silent damage the first episode described. At first, there's an episode where something you gave wasn't enough. You mentally note it. Next time, you give a little more. That seems to work temporarily. And then, the standard adjusts without anyone announcing it. What was enough yesterday is today's minimum expected. And so, through cycles of effort and apparent dissatisfaction and renewed effort, you keep escalating in a direction that has no ceiling. Seneca had an image for this worth remembering. He spoke of the man who runs after a goal that moves, who accelerates because he got close for a moment, who loses his breath but doesn't stop because the distance seems to shrink, who eventually can't go on, not because he arrived anywhere, but because his ability to run was exhausted. The emotional vampire doesn't move the standard consciously, but the standard moves anyway because the mechanism producing it is structural in them, not strategic. And whoever runs after it can't win the race because the race has no finish line. That's not your failure. It's the nature of the course you were invited onto. Marcus Aurelius distinguished very clearly between problems that have solutions and those that don't, not to surrender before the latter, but to not waste resources trying to solve the unsolvable. There are problems in relationships that have solutions when both people commit to finding them, when there's willingness to change, to recognize the impact of one's own behavior, to work towards something different. And there are dynamics that have no solution from within the relationship because the mechanism producing them isn't in the relationship, but in the internal structure of one of the people. The emotional vampire who has no awareness of their pattern, who isn't in a process of recognizing and working on it, cannot offer you what you're looking for. Giving more won't produce it. That's not a judgment on their value as a person. It's a diagnosis about the compatibility between what you seek in a relationship and what that person can offer at this moment. And that diagnosis, made with the cold precision Epictetus taught, without the heat of resentment or the blindness of love that wants what cannot be, is what allows you to decide well, not what to do. How to see, and from the correct vision, what you should do generally becomes clearer than it seemed when the vision was clouded. There's a final question about the 5 signals I want to leave before closing. How many of the 5 did you recognize in the same relationship? I'm not asking you to answer out loud, not even to answer mentally with an exact number, only to let the question exist, because one signal in a relationship could be a difficult moment of a relationship that generally works well. 2 signals begin to draw a pattern. 3 or more signals that consistently coexist in the same relationship are no longer incidents. They're the map of that relationship structure. And maps, however painful to look at, are always more useful than unexplored territory. Look at the map tonight with the calm of someone evaluating information without rushing toward any conclusion. Only the honest look these episodes are trying to help you recover. There's something about the 4th signal, physical exhaustion, I want to expand because it touches something about biology that Stoicism intuited without having the vocabulary to fully articulate it. The human body has alarm systems that evolved over millions of years to detect threats. Those systems don't distinguish between the physical threat of the predator and the social threat of the person who extracts without reciprocity. Both activate similar stress responses. The heart that accelerates, the breathing that changes, the muscles that tense, the nervous system that enters a state of alert. In the physical threat, those responses resolve relatively quickly. The predator leaves or doesn't. The threat passes or doesn't. And the body returns to its baseline state. In the chronic social threat, the responses don't have a clear resolution point. The person who extracts doesn't disappear. The pattern doesn't end. And the body producing the stress response never receives the signal that it's safe to return to a state of rest. The result of that over time is what medicine calls chronic stress. And chronic stress has real, measurable physical consequences on the immune system, on the cardiovascular system, on sleep cycles, on hormonal levels, on cognitive capacity. Seneca knew this without being able to name it in those terms. He knew it because he was a precise observer of his own experience and that of those around him. And he wrote about the relationship between the state of the soul and the state of the body with a consistency that suggests he understood the connection, even if he couldn't articulate the mechanism. The exhaustion you feel after being with the emotional vampire is not weakness. It's the body reporting the real cost of a state of alert that had no resolution. And that report, taken seriously, is clinical information as well as emotional, not to produce alarm, to produce respect for what the body is communicating. About the 5th signal, the bottomless well, there's something I want to add about the stages typically traversed by whoever is in that dynamic. The first stage is the genuine attempt. You give from love, from the desire for the relationship to work, from the belief that if you find the right way to give, the recognition will come. The second stage is doubt. You start wondering if what you give isn't enough because you're not giving the right thing. You change the what you give, the how much you give, the how you give. You experiment. You search for the combination that produces the response you're looking for. The third stage is exhaustion. You've exhausted the variations. You've given in different ways, in different amounts, at different times, and the result is always the same. The gap persists. The recognition doesn't arrive. The debt doesn't close. The fourth stage, which not everyone reaches, is recognition. The understanding that the problem isn't in what you give or how you give it. It's in the structure of what you receive in return. That recognition, when it arrives, can feel like failure. As if there were a conclusion about your insufficiency in the fact that nothing you tried worked. But Epictetus would invert exactly that interpretation. The one who arrives at recognizing they were, running after a goal that moves, didn't fail. They developed enough clarity to stop running in that direction. And that clarity, even if it arrives late, even if it cost a lot along the way, is exactly the type of wisdom Epictetus considered more valuable than any philosophical theory, the kind that comes from direct experience converted into real understanding. If you're in any of those stages, the fourth in particular, what you feel tonight is not the end of something. It's the beginning of the clarity that the philosophical work of this entire series is trying to help you build. That's what the fifth signal, in its most complete version, offers. Not just the diagnosis of the bottomless well, the understanding of what stage you're in and what comes after that recognition. And what comes after, when the clarity settles and the decision emerges from a calmer place, is always closer than it seems in the moment of maximum discomfort. There's something about the 5 signals as a whole that's worth articulating before this episode closes. The 5 signals don't measure 5 separate things. They measure 5 dimensions of the same central problem: one-sidedness, the flow that always goes in the same direction. The first signal measures the one-sidedness of attention. Always toward them, never genuinely toward you. The second measures the one-sidedness of power. Their needs can always cross your borders. Yours can never cross theirs. The third measures the one-sidedness of time. They're present when they need it, absent when you need it. The fourth measures the one-sidedness of the energetic exchange. They take without returning. And the fifth measures the one-sidedness of recognition. What you give is never enough. What they receive never produces gratitude that closes the debt. 5 dimensions. One single problem, that of someone who can't relate reciprocally. That inability, as we've explored throughout this episode, isn't necessarily chosen. It isn't malice in most cases. It's a structural limitation with roots in that person's history that produces real consequences in the people around them, regardless of its origin. And the way the Stoics would have responded to that limitation is the same. They taught for all limitations beyond one's own control. Don't spend energy trying to change what you can't change. Focus that energy on what is within your power, your response, your decisions, your boundaries. The way you relate to that person given what you now know about how that relationship works. That's what's within your power. Not the transformation of someone who extracts into someone who can genuinely give, but the way you position yourself regarding that extraction. And that second part, what's within your power, is exactly where Stoic wisdom has the most to offer. Not in the diagnosis of the problem, in the tools for responding to the problem from the greatest inner freedom possible. Those tools are what the coming episodes will build, because recognizing the problem is the first step. The work of what to do with that recognition is what follows. And that work has its own time, its own rhythm, its own stages, none of which require that tonight you have all the answers. Only that tonight you have more clarity than you had this morning. That's enough for today, and tomorrow, a little more. There's something about signals 4 and 5 together that connects in a way that illuminates something important about the nature of the emotional vampire. The two signals together describe something rarely named directly. The emotional vampire produces a very specific type of hunger, not hunger for food or material resources, hunger for self-recognition. When someone doesn't listen to you, doesn't see you, doesn't return what you give, doesn't acknowledge your value, there's a need that goes unsatisfied repeatedly. And that unsatisfied need doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And in that accumulation there's something that may be uncomfortable to name, but deserves to be said. The emotional vampire's dynamic can make you more dependent on them, not less. Because each small moment of apparent recognition, each moment where they seem to finally see you, has a disproportionate impact precisely because it arrives in a context of scarcity. Like when you've been hours without water, and any sip seems like the best you've ever had. Not because the water is better than under normal conditions, because deprivation amplifies the value of the little that arrives. That's exactly what the emotional vampire's cycle of scarcity and flashes of recognition produces. A dependency that doesn't resemble dependency when you're doing well. One that comes from deprivation rather than abundance. And that form of dependency, that thirst that makes any sip seem sufficient to stay, is one of the reasons these relationships are so hard to leave, even when the diagnosis is clear. Seneca would have named this with the precision that characterizes his best writing. He said, "Hope is a trap when it's fed by whoever has control over when and how much of what's hoped for is delivered." When someone controls the frequency and intensity of moments of recognition, they also control the hope that there will be more. And hope, when it's controlled by another, is no longer yours. It's the instrument someone else uses to keep you where they need you. Recognizing that doesn't produce hopelessness. It produces something more useful. The possibility of beginning to build. That recognition from a source that can't be controlled by anyone but you. From within. Which is exactly where this series, in the episodes that follow, will be pointing. We've reached the end of the second episode, 5 signals, 1 profile. And, before closing, I want to tell you something about what you just did by listening to this. It's not nothing. Listening honestly about something that may be happening in a relationship that matters, without the distortion of love that wants everything to be fine, without the filter of habit that has normalized what shouldn't be normal. That requires a courage few people have, not the dramatic courage, the harder kind. The kind of looking in the mirror without fixing the expression first. If any of the 5 signals resonated, if upon hearing any of them, there was that uncomfortable recognition of, I know this, even though I'd rather not know it, that's not a sign you're at the worst moment of your life. It's a sign you're beginning to see what the dynamic had made invisible. And seeing is the first act of someone who can choose. Seneca wrote that the man who sees his situation clearly, even though what he sees is difficult, is already freer than the one who lives in the comfort of not knowing. Because what you don't see, you can't change. What you see, even if you don't yet know exactly how, at least has the possibility of changing. That possibility, small or large, depending on where you are tonight, is already yours. Let's briefly walk through today's 5 signals. The first, the conversation always ends up revolving around them, not an isolated incident. The consistent pattern where your inner world functions as a springboard to theirs, where listening is disguised waiting, where being genuinely heard is something you can't remember when it last happened. The second, your boundaries are treated as negotiable suggestions. Your no as the start of a negotiation you'll always lose. Your autonomy as an inconvenience to their plans, and most insidiously, that somehow you end up justifying your right to have set the boundary you set. The third, they only show up when they need something from you. The perfect radar for your periods of emotional availability, the intensity when they need, the absence when they don't. Being the last one who answers the phone, not as an honor, but as a sign that everyone else has already protected themselves. The fourth, after seeing them, you need to recover. The tiredness with no concrete explanation. The energetic bill the body charges with precision, even as the mind seeks justifications. Your nervous system recognizing what your reasoning still doesn't want to admit. The fifth, nothing you do is enough. The standard that moves when you get close. The permanent emotional debt that doesn't close. And the moments of apparent recognition that are the coins tossed so you keep playing a game whose rules are written so you never win. 5 signals. Not for you to check off the ones that apply and reach a verdict, for you to let them exist in you tonight, without rushing toward any conclusion. Real clarity doesn't arrive in the emotional moment of a listen. It arrives in the days that follow, when the questions you opened settle and begin to answer themselves from a calmer place. Give them that time. Before this episode closes, there's something I want to ask of you. Think of a person in your life with whom conversations always end up feeling complete, where, upon saying goodbye, there's something you didn't have when you arrived. Not necessarily a great revelation or a dramatic moment, just that specific feeling of having been seen and of having seen the other. When was the last time you felt that? Go to the comments and write when the last time was that you felt genuinely listened to in a close relationship. You don't have to name anyone or explain anything, just that approximate date or that word. This year, a long time ago, I don't remember. Because there's someone reading those comments who needs to know they're not alone in that void. And because putting that date into words, even in a comment that seems minor, is the first step of someone who's beginning to evaluate what they're receiving from their relationships beyond what they're giving. Next week, we go a level deeper. There's a profile that shares some characteristics with the emotional vampire, but operates more actively, more intentionally, harder to see exactly because they're better at hiding what they do. Not someone who drains without realizing it, someone who manipulates knowing what they do. Episode 3 is called The Manipulator. And if the emotional vampire left something uncomfortable in you, the manipulator is going to feel surprisingly familiar. Because many times they're not separate profiles, they're the same profile seen from different depths. If something today resonated, come back. What you don't name you can't change. And you've already named 5 things that perhaps had no name until tonight. That already matters. There's something about the journey of these 5 signals that deserves to be said before the episode closes completely. The 5 signals are not a list of accusations. They're a precision instrument. The difference matters. An accusation requires the other to be guilty of something, requires intention, requires that they consciously chose to cause harm. A precision instrument requires none of that. It only requires that what it measures is real. The emotional vampire, in most cases, doesn't choose to be one, in the sense that one morning they woke up and decided to drain the people around them. They operate from patterns they probably didn't choose either, from wounds they didn't heal, from a way of relating they learned in environments where that was the only way available. That doesn't cancel the effect on you, but it does change how you can see the situation, not with the heat of resentment toward someone who hurt you with intention, with the cold, compassionate understanding that what's happening has a logic that's not about you personally. You're the receiver of a pattern, not the chosen target of cruelty. Marcus Aurelius maintained that distinction with great clarity in his most difficult relationships. He didn't hate those who harmed him. He understood. They acted from their limitation. And from that understanding, he could make decisions about his own behavior that weren't contaminated by the reactivity of resentment. That understanding is available to you too, not to excuse, to liberate, to free you from carrying the rage towards someone whose behavior probably has nothing to do with you. And from that freedom, to make the decisions your life and your well-being require with more calm, with more clarity, with more access to the wisdom resentment blocks. There's something more about this episode I want to name, the fact that the 5 signals can coexist in different intensities. Not everyone who recognizes some of them is. In the worst possible scenario, there are people in whose life the emotional vampire is a minor presence, a peripheral friend who drains in encounters, but whose total impact on life is manageable. There are people for whom it's a central presence, a partner, a close family member, someone from whom it's hard to distance without significant consequences. And there are many degrees between the two. This episode doesn't prescribe a single response. What it prescribes is vision, seeing with precision what's happening, evaluating the real impact of the dynamic on your well-being, and from that honest evaluation, deciding what type of relationship you want to have with that person and under what conditions. Those decisions are completely yours and are completely different depending on who the person is, how much the relationship matters, what real options you have, what you're willing to try before arriving at other conclusions. What this episode can offer you is clarity about what's happening. What you do with that clarity is beyond the reach of any podcast episode. It's in the territory where you live, where you know the details no general description can know, where you have access to all the information that makes your situation different from any other. Seneca had a final phrase about self-knowledge that is the most fitting close I can find for this episode. He said that knowing yourself well is the work of a lifetime, that no one reaches the end of that work completely, but that each step taken in that direction, each moment of clarity gained about what one is and what happens to them, is in itself an act of freedom no one can take from you. This episode was one of those steps. 5 signals. 5 ways of seeing more clearly something that was perhaps being difficult to see. Take them with you this week, not as a verdict, as lenses, and observe with them whatever you observe. There's something about the journey of the 5 signals that completes the picture in an important way. The 5 signals this episode described are not a personality test of the other. They're a test of the dynamic, and that distinction considerably changes how you work with the information. When we judge a person, we turn them into a type: the emotional vampire, the one who drains, the one who always needs and never gives. And that has the problem that people are more complex than types. They have moments where they don't fit the type. They have capacities the type doesn't contemplate. They have a history the type ignores. When we evaluate a dynamic, what we look at is the pattern of the exchange over time, what the relating produces in both parties, the direction of the flow of emotional resources, the net effect of the relationship on each person's well-being. That's more precise and more useful. Because from the evaluation of the dynamic, the possible questions are more interesting than the verdict about the person. Can this dynamic change? Are there conditions under which it could change? Does the person in question have the awareness and willingness necessary to participate in that change? Or is the dynamic so established that the only possible move is the adjustment of distance? Those questions are more useful than condemnation, and they're available to you now that you have the diagnosis of what's happening. Marcus Aurelius didn't make decisions about the people around him from the heat of the moment or from the simplification of judgment. He made them from the patient observation of the pattern and from the honest evaluation of what was possible and what wasn't. That same quality of evaluation is available to you. Not tonight, perhaps. Tonight is for letting what you heard settle. But in the days that follow, when the information these 5 signals offer has had time to integrate with everything you already knew about that relationship before hearing this episode, when the clarity these signals can produce has the space to settle on calmer ground than that of immediate listening, from there, the questions about what to do answer themselves better. And the answers that arrive from that place have greater chances of being the ones that truly correspond to your situation. Seneca closed many of his letters with something that seems modest but is actually profound. He said, "It was enough for today." That wisdom isn't absorbed all at once. That you have to give it time for what's learned in a moment to become real understanding in the days that follow. This episode is enough for today. 5 signals, a diagnosis still being processed. Give it time, and when you're ready for the next step, the next episode awaits, with a profile that shares territory with the emotional vampire, but operates in a different dimension and with different tools. Not the one who drains without realizing it, the one who manipulates, knowing on some level what they do, and who does something the emotional vampire doesn't do. They deliberately choose you as their target. That, which is what episode 3 will explore, completely changes the terms of how the situation is navigated. If something today moved you, come back next week. What you see can't be unseen, and what can no longer be ignored, sooner or later, becomes the starting point of something different. Before closing this episode, I want to name something I haven't said directly, and that matters. This episode doesn't ask you to make any decision this week. I know this because decisions about relationships that matter aren't made well in the moment of maximum emotional clarity. They're made better when the clarity has time to settle. When the information you received in a moment of openness integrates with everything you already knew before hearing this. What this episode asks is something different and smaller. That in the coming days, when you're with the person who came to mind at the beginning, you observe. With the scientist's attention, Epictetus taught, without adding drama, without minimizing what occurs, without seeking to confirm what you already suspect or defending what you'd prefer to be true. Just observe. Do conversations end where they started or always drift? Are your boundaries received as boundaries or as starting points for a negotiation? Does the person show up with the same consistency when they don't need anything? Does your energy go up or down after encounters? Does the gap between what you give and what seems expected close or persist? Those observations, accumulated over days, produce a more honest image than any evaluation made in the heat of a specific moment. And that more honest image is the material from which good decisions can eventually be made. Marcus Aurelius made similar observations about the people around him, not in a paranoid way or with the intention of building cases against anyone, but with the curiosity of someone who wants to understand what's in front of them, to be able to respond well, to be able to be who he wanted to be in every interaction, to not be surprised by what was actually predictable if he had looked with enough honesty. That honest curiosity about what's in front of you is what this episode tries to cultivate, not suspicion. Curiosity. And there's an important difference between the two. Suspicion already has the answer and looks for evidence to confirm it. Genuine curiosity doesn't yet know the answer and observes to find. Today's 5 signals are tools for the second, not to convince you of anything, to help you see more clearly what's already there. And what's already there, seen with clarity, speaks for itself, without needing this episode or any other to tell you what to conclude. The conclusion, when it arrives from that place of honest observation, will already be yours, completely yours, and that the conclusion is yours and not borrowed from any external voice, is exactly the difference between wisdom that changes something real and information that passes through the mind without leaving a trace. There's something the close of this episode needs to say about the nature of the clarity the 5 signals produce. Clarity doesn't always feel good when it arrives. Sometimes it feels like loss, like the dismantling of a story you'd been building for a long time so the situation would make sense. Like the end of something you don't yet know if you wanted to end. And that discomfort of clarity, that specific pain of seeing with more honesty than you had before, is a sign that something real is happening. Not that you're going in the wrong direction, that you're going in the only direction that produces real change. Marcus Aurelius had a phrase about truth. I keep finding the most useful available for these moments. He said, truth cannot hurt you if you're willing to receive it, that the pain of seeing clearly isn't the pain of truth. It's the pain of the distance between what you saw before and what you see now. A pain of adjustment, not of wound. And that adjustment, however uncomfortable in the moment, is exactly what the mind needs to be able to orient more precisely toward what truly matters, not what seemed to matter from the distorted image, what matters from the more honest vision. There's something more about the process of the 5 signals worth naming. The process of seeing them isn't linear. There are people who hear this episode and feel immediate clarity. A kind of recognition that arrives fast and seems to organize a heap of experiences that before seemed disconnected. There are others who hear it and feel primarily resistance, An inner voice saying, yes, but in my case it's different. Yes, but this doesn't apply completely. Yes, but they have their reasons. Both responses are valid. The first may be genuine clarity, or it may be emotional activation that feels like clarity, but will settle into something more nuanced when the moment passes. The second may be denial, or it may be the legitimate recognition that the nuances of the specific situation don't completely fit the general description. There's no way to know from outside which of the two it is. Only you can know, and probably not tonight. But in the days that follow, when the activation of the moment calms down and the more stable information remains, what is true in both cases is this: the 5 signals exist. They're observable in the experience of many people. And if some of them resonate in your specific experience, that resonance deserves to be taken seriously, not as a verdict, as data that's added to all the other data you already had about that relationship. And the more complete picture that results from adding that data is what deserves to be the starting point of any honest reflection about what you want to do. Epictetus closed many of his teachings with a question that turned out to be more revealing than any answer. The question was simply this: and now, what do you do with this? Not what should you do, not what the wise person would do, not what philosophy prescribes. What do you do? That question, directed inward with honesty, is what leads from knowledge to action, from signal to response, from seeing to choosing. And choosing, for the Stoics, was the most fundamental and most human act available. Not perfect choosing, not the kind that never makes mistakes or always has complete information. Conscious choosing, the kind that comes from having seen as well as possible in the conditions available. That's what this episode sought to do: help you see a little better. The choosing is yours. It always was. This is Stoicism for winners. This is relationships that destroy you. Now comes the part that separates those who listen from those who truly change. This community exists because you decide it exists, not with words, with actions. If something you heard today moved you inside, leave your reflection here. The one that gets the most support becomes the banner of this community, the collective voice of everyone who chose not to give up. A community that doesn't run from pain, that walks through it, with courage, with judgment, with honor. But listening isn't enough. You know it. You feel it. There's a difference between the one who consumes wisdom and the one who turns it into armor. That's why we created the Stoic Code. 2 principles forged over millennia by the most powerful minds in history. It's not just another book. It's a manual of psychological warfare against your own weaknesses. Each principle includes the deep teaching, its modern application, and an exercise you can implement today, not tomorrow, today. If you decide to get it, you're not just taking something for your growth. You become part of this mission. You help us bring Stoicism to thousands of people who are right now where you once were, who struggle, who fall, who need a word to remind them who they are. Your support keeps this podcast alive. It drives it. It expands it. Thanks to you, this doesn't stop. The link is in the description of this episode. Everything you need is right there. We'll see you in the next episode of Stoicism for Winners. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, without fail. Stoic sessions designed to be with you when life gets heavy, when staying calm is hard, when you need someone to remind you who you are before you forget it yourself. Follow us. The Stoic who doesn't train in calm won't find calm when the storm arrives. Until the next episode, we walk this path together. And every day, there are more of us who choose not to give up. Remember this: you are the sole owner of your perception, the architect of your peace, the only one responsible for the war you choose to fight, or the one you choose to end. That is Stoicism, not a philosophy, a way of being unbreakable. This is Stoicism for winners.